In 2025, in the US alone, I believe it's around 400,000 women left the workforce. And the number one reason cited for voluntary departures is caregiving needs.
Hello, Jess.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy that you're leading this conversation today. How are you doing?
I'm good, and it feels like such an important and timely conversation. We have Mother's Day coming up, and there's so many talks of all of these different caregiving challenges in the workplace right now. So I'm happy to be having this very timely conversation with you as a fellow mother and caregiver.
Yeah, yeah. It feels very timely as I was
Mhm.
just sharing with you offline. I This week has been one of those weeks where I got called into more intense caregiving. And I was
Mhm.
thinking about this conversation the whole time that I've been kind of juggling a number of things.
Mhm.
So, yeah, so I'm really happy that you brought this forward. One for Mother's Day, and then I think the other thing to me is just we talk so much about how EVP and employer brand, its real power is how it shows up in the moments that really matter to us. It's not about just job advertising. That is certainly one component of it, but when we think of it just as that, we miss so many key elements that drive performance. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about that. Before we get deep into the conversation,
Mhm.
because I'm excited to get in there, can you introduce to the listeners a little bit about you, your role here, and outside of the office?
Absolutely. So I am a director of employer brand and culture, and I think I'm now a Blue Ivy vet of almost 5 years. And in my time here, I've had the privilege of managing and being a part of both national and global projects to uncover that unique employer brand story by way of the EVP, the employee value proposition. And so I've delivered EVPs and employer brand strategies for some very well-known global brands, taking the EVP and embedding it into recruitment marketing through segmented messaging, for example, and equipping managers and TA teams with playbooks to really tell that consistent story across geography, line of business, and even multiple sub brands. And I've also had the privilege of working with some incredible not for profit organizations to truly embed the EVP into every aspect of the employee journey so that it becomes a consistent lived experience and can serve as a lens through which to make decisions. But I am also a mom to a 2-year-old girl who inspires me every day to try and make the world a better place for the next generation through the world of work. And I think becoming a mom has really made me more resilient. It's given me much greater comfort with ambiguity. It's honed my time management skills, my prioritization skills, and it has tested my patience dealing with one of the most difficult stakeholders of my career, all while delivering results with a smile on my face.
I love that.
Yeah.
I assume because it is life changing, especially that moment that you're in, um, having your first child. Can you talk a little bit about how your daughter being back at work, how it's shaped this passion that
Mm,
you now have
yes.
for this topic?
Yeah, I think when I ask myself, how did I arrive here and why am I passionate about this? I think I reflect on 2 experiences that have really shaped how I think about the way caregivers experience the employer brand and culture. The first was when my husband went back to work actually, from parental leave. Now we had split the leave, and so I was already back at work when he returned. And when he went back, I started to see very quickly that work just isn't designed for 2 working parents. He is in a unionized, male-dominated environment, and there are a lot of benefits for sure, but there's no flexibility. There's no acknowledgement of caregiving, and I could see how hard that was for him and for many of his peers who were in the same stage of life. Now, the second experience was much more personal for me. As you may remember, about a year ago, our daughter was hospitalized unexpectedly, and she needed surgery. And so I was in the hospital with her 24/7 for a week. But at the same time, I had some very big deliverables. I had client obligations at work. And so I remember feeling very nervous to tell the team about what was going on and to ask for the space that I needed. But when I did, the response was incredible because the team stepped in, leaders reached out, and I genuinely felt that support, not just as an employee, but as a person. And so the contrast in these 2 experiences really stuck with me because in one case, I saw what happens when the workplace doesn't recognize the realities of caregiving and how limiting it can be. But on the other hand, I experience what it looks like when a company actually does live its employer brand and when values like trust and support show up in those real moments, not just in messaging. And so I think that's really shaped for me how I think about employer branding today because it's not what shows up on your careers page, right? It's how people experience the organization when life gets hard because it's these moments that your employer brand can be really tested and it's ultimately when employees decide whether they trust you or not.
So interesting that you gave that example. And I'm sure I mentioned it to you right when you were in that moment with your daughter. But the same thing happened to me with my youngest
Yep.
many years ago when I was working at another employer and she ended up in the hospital. And in that scenario, it was the same thing. I had some really intense deliverables and obligations, and I needed to step away entirely to be with her for a few weeks. She was in the hospital for a couple months, and the way that the employer showed up in that moment was incredible. But I guess in many cases, if it's not clearly articulated in the EVP, the values, it's not shared with leadership,
Mhm.
how you show up in those governance moments, it can be left to interpretation. And it certainly was for me way back when a moment that really locked me in to my employer because they understood me as a whole person and how what was really important to me at that moment.
Yeah, I mean, those are the moments that really make or break your loyalty
Yeah,
to an
for
employer, I find.
sure. For sure. Um, so talk to me a little bit about how you feel employer brand specifically can support, I guess, caregiving, whether you're a new parent or like me, perhaps supporting older generations.
I think, the employer brand ultimately it's perceptions of who you are as a place to work, right? And I think one of the important things to remember is everyone's perception will be different based on their lived experiences, their life circumstances. And so you or I, we both have caregiving obligations right now. But we're still going to interact with the employer brand in a different way. And so, one of the things that I think can be so powerful when we talk about how employer brand can support caregivers is something as simple as personas, talent personas. We often think about personas in terms of job seekers, but we don't necessarily understand the human who's doing the seeking. And so the reality is that people are going to experience your employer brand through the lens of what is happening in their life. So again, two employees in the same role can interact with the EVP and the employer brand in very different ways, depending on what they need from their employer or their leader in that given moment. And so I think there's this big opportunity when we talk about employer brand in understanding and I think actually measuring that, right? Because most organizations, interestingly enough, are not even asking the basic question to identify who is a parent or who is a caregiver. So they don't know how this group is experiencing things like growth, flexibility, or access to opportunity. And if you don't have that visibility, it's really hard to position yourself as an employer of choice for that particular segment, even if you have the right programs in place. But I think we talk about personas often as external positioning, but I think it can also be really valuable internally because personas help us understand our people. And so if we understand the way people experience work differently, it helps leaders adapt how they lead. So we're not applying this one size fits all approach to management, but actually delivering a more consistent experience of the culture and employer brand across the teams. So, yes, personas can be a really powerful branding tool, but I think at their best, it's a tool to help us understand people and design for an experience that actually holds up in real life.
Yes. So we've got a bunch of listeners, I'm sure, who are employer brand practitioners. They've done a great job building personas for exactly that audience that you say, the job seeker.
Mhm.
But what is their opportunity? So when you think about what you're saying, which is brilliant, what is the opportunity right now for them with the personas they have or revisiting the personas that they have internally? What would you say step one should be for them?
I mean, I think step number one is to look at the personas you have and ask yourself, what data is it based on? How did we obtain this? How are we measuring it? Because as I said, many organizations don't understand who their caregivers are to know how they experience the brand. And, managers are a critical tool for using those personas. Often we think about using those personas in the hiring process or in interviews to almost sell what you have to offer to a particular segment. But the manager can use that information to really make the experience practical, tangible, and relatable for this particular segment. And I think in a lot of cases, we really haven't equipped our managers on how to do that effectively or consistently, right? So they're left navigating these moments that are often very complex, very human, like someone returning from parental leave, for example, without a clear playbook for what the EVP or support or flexibility actually looks like and what it might mean to that particular segment in practice. And so I think it's not a lack of intent. I think there's a lack of clarity and a lack of understanding and perhaps sometimes a lack of ownership, right? Our managers are balancing fairness, performance, the needs of their team, but at the same time trying to support an individual who may be going through a major life transition. And without this guidance to understand their people, to understand what is needed and what is expected, they tend to fall back on things like instinct, assumptions, and perhaps their own life and career experiences. And so that's when things start to break down. Whether it's assuming someone isn't ready for an opportunity or expecting them to come back and operate exactly as they did before. And these moments matter because that's when your employee is really evaluating whether the employer brand holds up to their experience, to their needs. And when it works well, it's not complicated, but it is very intentional. And I think this looks like trust, right? A concept I've heard referred to as work style, which is giving people the autonomy over when and how to get their work done. It can look like having really clear human conversations, not making assumptions, but aligning on what success looks like in that moment. And I think it's also very practical support. And this could be benefits, it could be flexibility, or even small things that make a real difference in someone's day to day life. But for these things to happen consistently, I think organizations need to take their employer brand a step further, and they need to actually embed it into things like performance or leadership expectations and tools like an employer brand playbook or guidance like living the brand training allow managers to understand how to use the EVP in these real situations, because otherwise you can end up with an employer brand that is very strong in theory but an inconsistent experience in practice.
Yeah, there was a client that we did some work with a few years ago that actually took exactly what you're saying. They took the different stages of life and talked to their internal teams using the employer brand about the benefits and programs that are offered for each stage of life.
Mhm,
That young person that might be looking to get their first mortgage, that might be
mhm,
preparing to have their first child. What are the things that really matter to them that you offer as a company that they may not know about?
mhm,
So that you're both informing your team about what is available and enabling the managers to provide greater clarity and support so that it's not that moment that you experienced where you were terrified, how is everybody going to be able to deal with the fact I can't meet my client
Hey.
deliverables. The conversations have already started. And it's an easy way to talk to then that person that's now got aging parents or elderly and not well family members. What are the programs that are available there? What are the financial support systems that you may not be aware of that you can prepare for? And they did a great job of taking all of that employer brand messaging for stage of life and making that a huge internal communications program. And they actually saw they were a top employer. They got recognized as one of the top 10%. A year later, engagement and clarity had gone way up, and I'd love to think that some of the efforts they put behind that had a great deal to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it shows that you see people as human, right?
Yeah.
And that's such an interesting
Yeah.
example, Stace, because I'm also working with a client right now who, for the first time in my career, this client offers a dependent spending account. So I believe it's $7,000 a year that their staff get that they can use towards childcare costs, elder care costs, summer camp, all of those things. And interestingly enough, this organization also has very high CEO approval ratings. Their trust and leadership scores sit at 98%, and their ENPS scores are well above industry average because they recognize that their staff are people and they have needs and they support those human needs, even at the expense of profit. One of their leaders, their CEO, said to me, if I can make $1.20, that's great. If I can make a dollar, but I know that my employees are able to support their families, that's even better. And that's what I'm going to do.
Mm. Amazing. Amazing whoever, this organization is that they've invested in that. That is like a brilliant proof point about how much they care,
Thank you.
for their talent and they support that care. I also truthfully think, Jess, when I'm listening to you, like a light bulb just went off of like, as we think of the shifts that are happening with AI tools, kind of managing our workforce. A huge part of the shift that we are going to see when we think about copy with values, EVP, behaviors, it's not going to be the copy that's going to lead as much in the very near future. It's going to be the proof points, the governance systems, and taking this moment to do I love like how you started it with personas and stage of life and really understand our audience from this lens helps you with governance systems in embedding those in your AI leadership tools. I love it.
Yeah.
And did you say it was like 75%? I know you have some incredible stats. What percentage of our workforce are actually caregivers? Just like to amplify how much this
Yeah,
means.
it's sitting at about 80%
Yeah.
the population either is today or certainly will be in the near future. That's a
Yeah.
huge percentage of the population, and what's interesting is in 2025, in the US alone, I believe it's around 400,000 women left the workforce, and the number one reason cited for voluntary departures is caregiving needs, caregiving challenges. So this is a problem affecting a large portion of our population. And with that, there's a huge loss to the organization, right? You have not just the turnover and the cost associated with turnover, but you are also losing leadership pipeline. You are also worrying about then the long-term sustainability of your organization. There is data to support that when you have gender diverse teams, profitability is higher, financial performance is higher. And these caregiving needs and these caregiving challenges are disproportionately impacting women. And so to, acknowledge that caregiving as it sits today disproportionately impacts women, that means organizations are going to face a reality where women may be forced with a choice: fulfill their caregiving obligations or continue their career. But if we can activate the employer brand and connect that back to how we support this talent, whether it be our women or women identifying talent or our male fathers and caregivers as well, we have an opportunity to get ahead of that and to be the employer of choice for this talent that feels forced into making a decision.
Mhm. When you think about managers, because you've brought up a lot of really good ideas, and we're gonna equip them tomorrow. So let's just say we start with this. Okay, we've got an employer brand, we've got an EVP, we might even have personas that we built last year or the year before for attracting job seekers. Today, what we're saying is this is your moment to look at persona from a different lens. Let's look at the human lens, the stage of life, the challenges that they're dealing with our own employees today.
Mhm,
How would you do that? Would you start with a bit of a stage of life, kind of a survey,
mhm.
start to listen about what's really going on, what they're challenge navigating, what they wish they knew more about? What how would you start it,
Yeah,
Jess?
I think, in terms of what can we do today? How can we get started? If I had to point to one place, I think measurement is key. Because you really can't understand where your employer brand is breaking down if you don't understand how these different groups are experiencing it. And caregivers are a perfect example of that because in many organizations, we're not even asking the question. We don't know who they are, and we're not measuring their experience and their journey in a meaningful way. Now, I want to be clear that this doesn't mean requiring disclosure, but it does mean creating enough trust and psychological safety that employees feel comfortable sharing this context of their life. And then looking at your data through that lens. So, for example, things like engagement data, retention, promotion rates, even manager effectiveness. When we begin to segment our data, we can see where the experience isn't lining up with what our employer brand promises. I think what's interesting is sometimes you might find that you're already doing a lot of the right things, but we haven't connected the dots. And so we're not telling that consistent, compelling story about what we have to offer. And so from there, Stace, I'd say look at the experience itself, right? Because, as we said, your employer brand is not just what you say, it's what people experience consistently and over time, over their career. So I would be asking, does what we promise in our EVP actually show up across our employee life cycle? Is it there in hiring, in onboarding, in performance, and especially in those moments of change? Because that's when it's really being tested. And then finally, I think your managers. Your managers are your carriers of culture. We say that all the time to our clients. But do they have the right tools and the right training to bring the brand to life consistently? Do they know how to navigate these moments, how to have the right conversations and support people in a way that is consistent and is fair? Because if they don't, that's where the inconsistency starts. And ultimately, that is what erodes trust. So if we're going to start with measurement, that's let's then align it to the experience and enable our leaders because that is how we move from having an employer brand on paper to one that actually holds up when it matters most. And the reality is that it's easy to feel good about your employer brand in the best moments, but it's in moments of change, be it organizational change or personal individual change, like caregiving, where it's really tested. And those are the moments, as you've pointed out, and as I've pointed out, that people really remember. Those are the
Mhm.
moments that build loyalty.
Yeah, because they're such emotionally, um, kind of strained moments,
Mhm,
right? So you do react differently to how you're supported then. And I think like listening again to you, many organizations do have really great programs, even like we're a small organization, our benefits programs, we've got all kinds of great things that many people don't know all of the
mhm,
details of what's available. And being able to share what those are, not just from a benefits package, but from did you know,
mhm,
at this stage in your life, here's how we're going to be able to support you.
mhm,
When this moment happens, whether it's a purchase of a new home, like we said, or your first child, or you need to start doing some financial planning for A senior's home, like what are the different tools that we have and experts you can access during those moments, and making sure your managers know about that too. If they're keepers of culture, it really helps for them not to just point to a benefits package, but to be able to share that with this deeply human experience that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Stace, because it's not just about answering the question of what do we offer, but it's how does it show up over these moments in time. I think policy is a component of that. Are the policies clear and accessible? Are the benefits clear and accessible? Because employees want to understand the support that exists before they're ready to disclose something, right? And so making sure that they have that comfort and the knowledge from the get go.
Yeah. Just like it it's easy from my lens always to think about how it can be incorporated in a corporate office, you know? Um, but you mentioned your husband's experience in a union. As you were talking, I was thinking about nurses and, very different kind of scenario. Do you have a dreamscape of how you think organizations can support this situation for like caregiving in a more frontline type of a workplace?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because when we talk about flexibility, flexibility is easy to offer in corporate. It's harder in a role like nursing,
Yeah.
for example, or in my husband's
Yeah.
case. Um, I think the number one thing is being flexible where you can.
Yeah.
Flexibility will look different to every organization and in every role. In some cases, that may simply look like uh, predictable scheduling. Being able to have your schedule in advance so that you can plan accordingly and make care arrangements as needed. It could look like having the flexibility to take PTO on short notice if needed because your child is sick. I think it's just about understanding that, you know, employers like predictability. We like to be able to schedule and plan, but caregiving is in direct conflict with that. So if I take my husband, for example, he has to pick his vacation the year before it starts. So he's picked this year's vacation in December of last year. But if something comes up with our daughter, it doesn't allow him to have that flexibility to be there. And so that creates a tension for him because he can't be there when he needs her, when he wants to be. And then that also goes to put the strain on the default parent and the one who is there or who has to be there. So I think simply recognizing that care, it's not a gendered responsibility. It is not a personal issue because the reality is the infrastructure to support care is what allows us to have that supply of labor. So, from an economic perspective, it's critical that we recognize that caregiving exists. And by recognizing and accepting and finding creative solutions for our frontline workers or for those in a non corporate environment, that is how we can retain our people. That is how we can ensure that our employer brand steps up in those most challenging moments in life.
Jess, I think thank you for bringing this topic and for connecting it to Mother's Day. I think it's so special, but like you said, this isn't a gendered
Mm.
topic. Everyone really is a caregiver. Um I feel like I've learned a lot. I love just watching how you're evolving things because it makes me question as well ways norms that I've been used to because of how I've just experienced work, and I appreciate those challenges. I'm excited by some of the ways that this can apply, and when particularly as companies are really doubling down on the fact that they're so human. Everyone is in this age of AI now a very human focused, human centered, people first organization. And to live that commitment means to really understand the people and how they live outside of the organization, how we can bring the two together. That's the power of
Mhm.
employer branding is pulling the two together. Any last thoughts that you wanted to share with listeners?
Yeah, I think, one of the things I often hear people when they object to this conversation is that we don't want to lower the bar. And I just want to be clear, it's not about lowering the bar. It's about making sure that bar is transparent and ensuring that everyone has the equity they need to reach that bar, because that is when you get the most value and the greatest impact from every single one of your employees.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jess.
Thank
Lots of
you.
gems in there. Thank
Thank
you.
you.